Hello, my name is Eric Hines, and today we're going to be doing a podcast episode on everybody's favorite thing, fashion trends. That's right, everybody loves them. My personal favorite topic from my current class in college is actually was fashion, and fashion is kind of a huge thing in the modern day, so might as well bring the parallels here. So let's start back. Let's think about this. 1920s. Women are now more free than ever. It's the end of World War One. So they're cutting their hair short, you know, getting more bolder makeup. All choices that would have been unthinkable back then. Like literally, you do it a decade earlier, they would have been literally like outcasted from society. This is what everybody calls the flapper era. Now, in the flapper era, there's also the prohibition area, which is also a cool topic, but ignore that. We're not talking about the alcohol today. We are talking about clothing. And with these new style choices, it showed that the Victorian traditions have ended. The flapper was now a huge phenomenon. It spread like wildfire, kind of like TikTok trends today. But what about today's landscapes? What about today in general? Well, when I look at today's fashion landscape, I see the same underlying themes. It's more expressive, it has more individuality. Unless you look at a fashion show, then somebody looks like a toaster. I'm sorry, I'm not taking that one back. I will find a photo of like the most ridiculous one, and I will like put it up after I'm done with this, just to like prove a point. Sorry, I'm going on my own tangents, but that's why like it's my personal project. I want to make it as creative and as fun as possible. I will have bloopers in here. I want it to be funny. Anyway, but when everybody looks at today's fashion landscape, we can all agree the same thing. However, in the 1920s, accessing the latest trends required visiting physical stores or browsing printed catalogs too. You had to physically go into a store. You had to physically walk into, like, it's like walking into Target today, right? But now I can just pop on my phone and open up Target, and then I can see like there's pants for me, there's shirts for me. Women can do that too. In fact, online shopping is more prevalent today than ever. I mean, look at Black Friday. I already spent almost $300 myself on clothes on Black Friday. I don't have a problem. You do. Anyway, what's remained consistent on the emphasis of self-expression, though, I do want to get on this because I really love self-expression these days. It is probably one of the biggest, like, fake flags that we give ourselves because self-expression is done through individuality, where I believe the 1920s flapper movement was the beginning of individuality with women back then. But if we look at today's modern, it's more or less everybody follows the trend. Where in the 1920s, the trend was to like be a rebel. And comparing both trends, it shows how one conforms to society's like needs, which is modern, like it conforms to society's trends, where the other one was a personally rebellious trend that followed a chain reaction that changed the course of fashion over history. What's really interesting and what struck me interesting as well is that not only was fashion just everywhere at the time, but it was being advertised a lot. In fact, let's examine how fashion has been marketed to consumers over these decades, not only just the modern day, but also back then. In the 1920s, fashion advertising was straightforward and direct. You had print advertisements in newspapers, magazines, basically simpler messages. And it's literally the main message was, why should you wear tight clinging styles? Because of the latest thing. They offered stuff that was controversial at the time. They offered stuff that was seen as heinous for women to wear. And that is what pushed everybody towards that, the rebellious spirit of advertising. Just like in the modern day, advertising has its own conflicts of interest with our own people. In fact, I bet you saw that Apple iPhone ad, saw that it was vapor cooled, and thought this was the coolest thing since sliced bread. If you did that, please refrain from buying an iPhone 17. But back on topic, let's look at this for a second. They only had newspapers, print advertisements, but they also had billboards. They also had film stars wearing these dresses. It was unescapable, and it also I believe fashion from the 1920s not only influenced fashion itself, but how we advertise. Now, let me go into a side tangent here. I know that you want to know more about the fashion and why I'm getting more and more like infatuated with 1920s fashion, where I want to wear a top hat and everything. But let me get onto this real quick because I think I found something out. Think about this. Advertising these days, you say something through your phone and that thing appears on your phone. But what about your computer? I see ads all the time from Target, Macy's, and everything, and that's due to cookies and everything else. Cookies back then was word of mouth. Now, if you could get a magazine into all their hands at once, then you would know the latest fashion trends, you would know what to buy, and you would know everything. That is modern day consumerism, and we missed it, fellas. We missed it. It was in the 1920s. It's not on your Blackberry. Anyway, I just like this is such a big topic. Nobody talks about this. It actually genuinely is making me scared because there's so much like actual like factual evidence that not only did fashion from the 1920s influence the literal thing on your TV during the Super Bowl called ads, but they also influenced what modern day fashion is. Like that is such a big chain reaction, and that happened after World War One. A lot of us make fun of World War One because everybody. Sorry about that. There was a split here because my audio software decided to crash and burn. Anyway, what I was trying to say is we all make fun of World War One as we think of World War One as a more traditional world. When that could be further from the case, as rebellion was already stirring in some cases with women wanting to help join the war effort, which we wouldn't really see until World War Two mostly, which unfortunately is sad. But again, we're talking about fashion, and World War One was not fashionable. It was gray, dark, bleak, and gritty. Nobody wants that. So let's get back to one of my favorite things is advertising. Again, that's right. Back on this topic, I want to do one last thing before we get into some other stuff that I think influence fashion. But let's look at the advertising landscape in modern day. So I've already mentioned it before, but what about the mass market print campaigns that then turns into digital marketing, that then turns into websites, that then turns into mega million corporations? Sorry, mega million dollar corporations. Mega million corporations would be like just corporation on corporation on corporation. Okay. Listen, I like to be funny. I like to be influential. I want to get my individual individuality. I'm keeping that in. I don't care. I think it's funny. Anyway, so section 5 on my script. We talk about the broader influences on fashion. Now, a lot of people think, well, you already talked about newspapers and stuff, and you haven't even gotten back on how the clothes are cool. Listen, dude, the advertising is how people knew about the clothes. If we didn't have the advertising and that impact with fashion included, then yeah. But what were the broader influences on fashion? In the 1920s, the post war period brought economic prosperity and shifting social norms, meaning that there's a rebellion about to be afoot. And this rebellion shifted to a more practical, comfortable clothing for women. And that was when the flapper style emerged. Now, in my eyes, today's fashion reflects current social movements like they did back then with body positivity, sustainability. But the two things that they didn't include until this point in the 1920s that we have today, in my eyes, was gender inclusivity and diversity. Because back then, it was very heinous to wear stuff that the flappers wore like a decade earlier. Like it was such a quick change that spiraled out of control. Kind of like AI today, where they have new advancement, new advancement, new advancement, but almost no stopping. Same thing happened in the 1920s here. So, why did the 1920s succeed so much? Well, think about modern day. And what I think it is that technology has also democratized fashion in both eras, honestly. Mass production in 1920s made it a huge commodity even amongst people who were not rich. They mass produced it so much that almost anybody could afford it, making it a more accessible thing to even those who wanted to follow the trends of their favorite movie stars, even like today. Now, let's think about the economic considerations now that I got onto that topic. Now, with money, you have to realize that we're talking about two different, very different metrics, especially with modern day and pre. Ah, sorry, the past and the present. Think about this. Let me get a drink real quick. Think about this for a second, right? We live in a world that influences fashion trends through fashion shows, through marketing, through everything like that. But what I didn't mention was that the prosperity following World War One was actually one of the catalysts, in my opinion. Now, why is that? I think it enabled the flapper movement to flourish. I mean, think about it. After World War One, people had disposable income. They could spend it on fashionable clothing, leisure activities, whatever that went with that lifestyle. In fact, after World War One, I believe that's what started everybody's true fixation and fixes on what could be modern in that day and age, of course. But in my eyes, the fashion cycle from the 1920s has not changed at all today. It is alive and thriving. What started in the 1920s just has a new coat of paint. That's the thing. Nothing changed. And that's what's beautiful about history. None of what I just said has changed from 1920s to the current year of 2025. What did change, however, is that advertising has now consistently served as a primary vehicle, where now it's not only that, it's now influencers who are primary vessels with advertisement, sponsors, everything. You could be sponsored by Balenciaga by tomorrow if you are big enough, and you could get free clothing products. That's how they get their word out now. It has not changed. There's just new mediums to transfer it to modern day audiences, which is why I think the 1920s fashion trends are incredible and need to be researched more into understanding American consumerism and understanding capitalism as a whole. My name is Eric, and that's my rant for my final, and I will see you next time.